I think if you could go back nigh 200 years to the time of Schopenhauer, he would be very surprised that people in the 21st century would be quoting him or making reference to his work. And Schopenhauer had a lot of interesting things to say, but today I want to focus on his view of will, as it were. And it's relevant to the video and the topic, as you'll see in a bit. For that reason, I want to tie this famous quote he made into the topic of today. Der Mensch kann zwar tun, was will, kann aber nicht wollen, was will. Which means that man can indeed do what he wants. However, man cannot want what he wants. And this is fundamentally the crux of the matter, the crux of really any discussion or debate, because a lot of the rhetoric you'll hear these days about young men in particular is that they should adjust their desires, they should adjust their wants, and that they should be content with what they have. A lot of it can be reduced down to just don't want what you want, bruh. But as the illustrious Schopenhauer pointed out, nigh 2 centuries ago, of course, people can at least attempt to pursue what they want, they can do what they want, but they cannot want what they want. People want things, and these wants and desires are, to varying degrees, pretty mysterious. Their ultimate origin is mysterious. You can, of course, to some extent, lay out an evolutionary history and explain why certain desires are in place, but the specifics, they're mysterious, and we cannot willingly will into existence. And this is a fundamental issue that a lot of people face today, because there's also a dichotomy between how women are treated with regard to what they want and how men are treated with regard to what they want. So the rhetoric typically sounds like this when it comes to men. Your standards are too high. Don't want what you want. Reduce your standards, accept what you can get, and improve yourself. You don't have a right to, quote-unquote, want what you want. And to the extent that you do have these desires, you need to invest the time, energy, and effort into making sure that you are worthy of even having these desires, let alone achieving them. Quite the opposite when it comes to women, of course. Women simply have desires, and there's no standard for the desires. They simply have them, and they're acknowledged as such, and these desires must be fulfilled. Now, of course, there's a lot of discussion these days about women's expectations being way too high, and to some degree, that's very true. I've seen some recent interviews where young women in their early 20s were setting as a requirement 6-figure salaries for men they get together with. Not men in their 30s or 40s, but, mind you, men in their early 20s and mid-20s. And if you dig into the data, you'll see that almost no men in their early 20s or mid-20s are earning 6-figure salaries. Nonetheless, that is a common expectation. Now, of course, there's a bit of conflation between expectation and desire, but they often overlap, and the environment can prime desires. And I don't even fault women for having these desires. It's simply the environment. They're responding to the environment. Their hypergamy is kicking into overdrive. It's just their nature. It is what it is. The issue I have, and the issue I take, is that women are allowed to make these demands without any sort of requirement to warrant these things. Let's say, through some freak occurrence, some Chad guy who's only 24 or 25, earning $300,000 a year, really meets the requirements. So what exactly are these women, who are at best above average in some cases, going to bring to the table? That's the problem. There's no requirement that women bring anything to the table in an effort to meet their own desires. And yet for men, it is an absolute demand and requirement. A man cannot simply say, I want X. He needs to prove it. He needs to be worthy of it. And the equivalent simply doesn't exist for women. Something that credit where it's due, Rollo Tomasi has often stated, you can't negotiate desire. Women want what they want, but then again, so do men. If you attempt to accommodate yourself with something you simply don't want, it doesn't mean you're going to be content with it. Through life, you have to accept limitations, obviously. It doesn't mean you ever accept not wanting something. So I accept that I will sleep until I die very poorly for the rest of my life. Decades long of crushing insomnia have inflicted massive harm on me, but I never cease desiring to sleep well. It never happens. I always want to sleep well. You just accept certain limitations. And so, yeah, a guy might be content with being completely alone and isolated and not having any social contact, let alone female contact. That doesn't mean it's what he wants. And so it's a little bit confusing sometimes. Do these people want these guys to just basically shut up? And I think oftentimes it comes down to that. Or do they really want them to stop desiring the things that they purport to desire? Regarding the idea of men having to put in the work to quote-unquote earn what they desire, fair enough. It's always been that way. Women exist, and as long as they're decent looking, they will get attention. They don't need to do very much. But one thing that's occurred to me over the past couple of months is the preponderance of podcasts, discussions, channels talking about some version of male improvement. They don't necessarily call it self-improvement. Oftentimes it is literally called that, and oftentimes it's some list enumerated by some expert or some guy who's a high roller who spent the last 5 decades making tons of money being successful, saying that you need to do X, Y, and Z, and you need to take these steps. But as the Lord of Gingers, Pete, the guy who is always invited to gatherings, has once stated, in the context of Chad Williamson, you never see anyone have a podcast about what you need to do when you're starting at rock bottom or near rock bottom. I'm not claiming that these guys who've succeeded in life never had any struggle or failure. Of course they have. The point is there wasn't enough failure such that they failed, right? And you have this slew of men, particularly young men, and they're always talking about it. I recently listened to this podcast between Chad Williamson and yet another guy talking about the failure of boys and young men to launch in society. And the pablum I hear again and again is always the same. So it would be really interesting if in quote-unquote fixing themselves, men were given some advice, especially the young men, on how to do it exactly when they're starting with very little or next to nothing. I'm sure you can hear some story about rags to riches, about how some guy managed to make it, but that's not normal. That's not the standard tale. And as I've stated recently, I'm firmly convinced that we're at the stage now where some men, maybe even large numbers of men, need some kind of direct intervention. It's not going to be enough to just watch a video and tell them, you need to do this. This is what you should be doing. Because real intervention could produce real results. Now, of course, eventually you got to get off the training wheels. But the kind of intervention, you want to call it mentorship, you want to call it whatever, that's going to actually allow them to succeed for a while, albeit with some help, to the point where they have enough of that Matthew loop of success such that they can pursue it further down the line. And what a lot of these guys, these high flyers and high rollers, refuse to acknowledge is that's what they had. They had that, and that's what's fundamentally lacking now. There's a lot more loneliness, a lot more isolation in the male population than there has been in previous decades. And that's a big part of the reason why a lot of these guys are quote-unquote losers and not doing what they're quote-unquote supposed to be doing. But of course, getting some dude who went from nothing to becoming a garbage man, which is a kind of success if you ask me, wouldn't exactly be a very interesting guest for most podcasts. And so, let's be honest, at the end of the day, all this talk, all this rhetoric about self-improvement and men falling behind, it's just that. It's rhetoric, it's entertainment. No one's really serious about helping men. And they never have been. It just happens to be that the environment now is so caustic and hostile to the male psyche that the situation is just a lot more dire than it has been in previous decades. In any event, thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like, share, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. And if I am still alive, I'll check you out later. May the gods watch over you. Hopefully they have been. Take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.